especially on this beautiful summer evening. My name is Nazareth. I'm the program coordinator here at the Africa Center. And for those of you who are just visiting us for the first time, the Africa Center is a cultural institution that is focused on being a gateway to contemporary Africa for the diaspora, those of African descent, and contemporary Africans. We're grateful to be here tonight with Nadifa Mohamed and Ladan Osman to talk about Nadifa's book, The Fortune Men. I'll just give you short bios on the two of them, and then we can get started. Ladan Osman is the author of Exiles of Eden, winner of the Hurston Wright Legacy Award and a Whiting Award, and the Kitchen Dweller's Testimony. Winner of the Sillerman Prize, her work in film includes The Ascendants, Sam Underground, and The Son of the Soil. She lives in New York. Nadifa Mohamed was born in 1981 in Hargeisa, Somaliland. At the age of 4, she moved back with her family to London. She is the author of Black Mamba Boy and the Orchid of Lost Souls. She has received both the Betty Trask Award and the Somerset Maugham Award, and in 2013, she was named one of the Granta's Best of Young British Novelists. Her work appears regularly in The Guardian and the BBC. A fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, she lives in London. Please help me in welcoming them to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello? That's on. Why do I feel like rapping suddenly? I can't rap. I wanted to do a more personal intro for Nadifa, who I love so much. Suddenly it feels not very good, but that's okay. Nadifa recounts odysseys, migratory hearts, and people under pressure. There are strangers in strange lands and also familiar lands rendered strange by war, injustice, and other catastrophes of the state and of the heart. Her meticulous research renders her stories and its characters and locations cinematic in the sense that every aspect of the sensory and emotive is explored and answered for directly or obliquely. I love your work so much. The generosity too with which you share your curiosities online. If you don't follow her on Twitter already, you definitely should. And also that we have such a formidable voice writing about Somalis, a community that regularly encounters shortcut thinking. And so we're going to start by hearing Nadifa read in her own voice, which I think is always super important at book talks. And then we're just going to have a conversation. But yeah, I think that's it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Ramadan Kareem. Thank you for coming here when it's so warm outside and you're probably at the end of a long day of fasting or work or travel or whatever you've been doing. It's a real honor for you to be here. And it's a real honor for me to be here. So as Ladan said, and thank you for that very generous and powerful introduction. It seems not that long ago that I decided to write about my father, a short little record of his life for the children in my family. And from that point to here, it's been a strange and almost unbelievable journey. But I'm happy to be here tonight and to be talking about The Fortune Men. We were just quickly whispering about which section I should read. And I think I had a vague intention to read a passage where Mahmoud was about to start fasting in jail. He wasn't much of a faster or very religious before he was arrested, but that changes in his time in prison. But Ladan asked for another reading, which I also really like. We can try and do both. I'll start with the second one. It'll take me a while to find. I skip from edition to edition now. I find this one I'll start with. The night comes too late. The sun teasing him and sending the sky all kinds of colors before it tires and finally slinks below the horizon. Mahmoud has to crane his head this way and that before he spots the moon, hiding behind a bank of slow-moving clouds. They drift clear, and then he can see the sharp sliver of moon settling in for the night. Tomorrow will be the start of Ramadan. He is grateful that he will have something to occupy his mind, even if it is just hunger. It is an ugly sky tonight, full of gas and smoke. The night skies in Hargeisa made you think of God, while here they are worldly, contaminated by men and their ceaseless chimneys and bright lights. You can see one constellation, its Somali name lost somewhere in his memory, the English never known. In Hargeisa, where sunset meant genuine darkness, you could track the slow movement of stars and planets, glittering and pulling you up into a depthless, shifting sea with its coastline of purple, indigo, and black stretches. God reminds you through those night skies of how small and insignificant you are. And he speaks to you clearly, his anger and solace tangible in the rain he sends or withholds, the births or deaths he orders, the long waxy grass he gives, or dead broken earth he carves. The miasma above the prison, above Cardiff, suffocated Mahmoud's faith and separated him from God. He began to strut and bluster his days away and completely forgot that this life meant nothing and was as fragile as a twig underfoot. He had needed to be humbled. Mahmoud nods to himself. He can see God's wisdom so clearly now. Looking back to the bed, he makes the obligatory intention to fast the next day, using the Arabic sentence that his mother had taught him as a child, his sing-song intonation mimicking hers. Mahmoud lies down on his side, his head resting on his spongy biceps, and thinks about shaving the whole of his head, a clean start like pilgrims do after the Hajj, the sins of the old life shorn away. But how would he look with his broad face and small jutting ears? What scars and lumps might be revealed? What would a jury think? A white jury, already prepared to hate him, if he stood there with no hair to soften him. They would not think of Hajj or purification, no. They would think him a madman or a hardened criminal, a wild savage needing the chastening of the law. He can't risk it. He'll neaten up his wiry hair with a short back and sides in the morning and start pulling himself together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful. I don't know that I've heard you read for a very long time, and we haven't been in conversation since like 2016,
In Oslo.
2017 together.
Yeah.
So my first question is actually one of the most favorite questions that I was ever asked by the historian, Dr. Michael Gomez. And he'd asked me, are you a time traveler?
I think so. I didn't think of myself like that until quite recently. But one weird thing that's been happening that I've become aware of is that my mind can't tell the difference completely clearly between things I've experienced, things I've read, and things I've imagined. Okay. And things I've been told. And that's weird. It's not comfortable. And I think it's partly the writing, it's mostly the writing, and being, especially with the kind of fiction I work on, it's based often on real stories. So you're taking real facts, whatever real facts may be considered, and then adding to them. And your brain starts not being sure how do you tell reality from fiction? You know, does that memory I have really match with something I've experienced, or is it a mixture of my fantasy filling in the gaps? So yes, I think I time travel into my father's history, into my mother's history, into other people's history, and it's a form of time travel.
Do you find, I'm not even sticking to the thing that I sent you. Do you find that people I mean, we say fiction and movies and things transport us all the time, but that people are really and truly transported when reading your work, because it was really hard to come out of the world of the Fortune Men. And that's also what made it difficult. Like, you want to read the whole thing in one go, but there's no way to do that. And so is that something that you have to navigate just even as a writer and, as someone who's making things in the world, that people might have these really strong reactions to your work?
I can't say if it was transporting for readers or is transporting for readers, but I could say that it was transporting for me. And this is my third novel, and it was in my mind for a really long time. But when I sat down to write, it just came out in one big flurry. It was quite quick for me. It took 18 months to write the first draft, and it was super long. It was 600 pages. And then this is the edited, distilled version of that. But I think I must, to produce that much writing for a slow writer like me in a short space of time, it was probably a case of me being transported to 1940s, 50s Cardiff, Tiger Bay, to Mahmoud's inner life. I could feel him, I could sense him. It felt very much as if it was a book that he took control of. And it was a book that maybe tackled spirituality and your inner world, your interiority more than my others did. So that spiritual state of being not within yourself exactly, not within your everyday state, I think that maybe some of that's transported or transmitted to the reader, or I hope it is.
I mean, I was having really strange dreams as Mahmoud, and that
Wow,
was
tell me more.
extremely hard for me. Well, I mean, I'll get to it in a little bit later because it has to do with the texture too of the book. But maybe we want to give a little bit of context. I mean, I'm sure some people are familiar because you're working, I think it's well known, the story, but
it's always
so however you want to sort of make a frame so that people know what we're talking about.
I think amongst Somalis, there was always a vague knowledge that there was a man who was executed in Cardiff, but the details had become vague. In the UK, it's known well in Wales, but not really outside. So Mahmoud Matan is a real man, was a real man who arrived in Britain, in Cardiff in 1947 and settled there with his Welsh wife. And by 1952, they'd had 3 children, they were legally separated, and Mahmoud was drifting and quite detached from both the Muslim and Somali community and every community, really. He was very much a loner. And then there's a murder in March 1952 of a Jewish shopkeeper, a spinster of 48. She was 41 years old, actually, same age as me. And it was a shocking crime. Tiger Bay had a reputation for certain crimes, but this was unusual. A woman brutally murdered in a shop while her family ate dinner in the next room was something that people wanted a quick solution to. And Mahmoud, because of his hostility to the police and various other issues, became the person that they latched onto.
I mean, I wonder about, because, people do this historical fiction and things all the time, but what is the complication of that for you? Because the way that you manage dread and also hope, there's not, though we know from the beginning what the story is, or if you read any summary, a review, it sort of leads with this thing, right? The execution, that's the most notable thing for some people, for many people about his life. And so this is a 2-part question, how do you manage that? Because it does feel very balanced and very loving. And then the other thing too, that was really interesting to me is that you kept his name. I mean, maybe this was for legal reasons, that you kept his name as is, but you changed the names of the woman who had been murdered
and her family.
And the family.
Yes. Do you know, it never occurred to me to change his name because it felt like a fig leaf. It was about him. It was closely based on the archival. I was about to say real, but I don't know if the archive is the real history of his life. It's one formal, official history. But changing his name would have it would have, I think, diminished the crime committed against him. And I had kept the original name of also the murder victim and her family, but I met her niece, who's still alive and still lives in Cardiff. And she asked me if I could change, because the trauma for her family and for her was still very raw. It was, what had happened was never spoken about, never resolved. The real killer was never found. So it was an easy decision to go along with her wishes. But for Mahmoud, and I guess there's also the question of, if I had changed his name, would I have then also changed who he was? And maybe that's something I didn't want to do. I wanted to stick close to this flinty, difficult, complicated man that he was.
He feels so real and known, and like you really think about like generation that you, even though I'm not familiar at all, like unfortunately, you know, my grandfathers passed either before I was born or when I was very young, and so I don't have a sense of that. Now I'm deviating from the thing, like that sense of like Somali manhood, but you really do get a sense of it. I wanted to ask, I forget the name of the original family, the murder victim's family. Did they ever speak to or make a public statement after? Because what has happened is you know, it was rectified by the British courts, and they found that there was all this like fake evidence and there was all this wrongdoing. And so they had a kind of, I don't know if it was a ceremony or an announcement of that. I think it was in the late 90s.
Yes, in 1998, Mahmoud's case was the first one picked up by a new commission set up by the Blair government. And it was to oversee and to look over potential historic miscarriages of justice. And there's no shortage of them in the UK and in many other countries, and most countries. But Mahmoud's case was the first one that they accepted. And they brought together his family. One of the chief prosecution witness, who was a man named Harold Cover, was invited. And they found a document, a notebook in the police archives, which they had hidden for a long time, which said that the man that they had been looking for was not Mahmoud Matan, but identified as another Somali sailor. So once that was found, the crux of the case collapsed. Mahmoud was not the man that they were looking for, and his conviction was quashed, overturned. And it took some time for his family then to be compensated. It was all very new. And that was another thing that struck me, that, you know, Britain has had people who've been executed for crimes they didn't commit for hundreds of years. It's not, sadly, very unusual. But for it to be a Somali sailor and his destitute family who survived him, who become the first in that historical moment to look over these cases and to try and bring some sort of justice to bear, I thought that was really powerful. And again, it felt like Mahmoud was an unusual and particular kind of person, a person who wouldn't rest. He almost haunted Tiger Bay and Cardiff. There were multiple appeals to try and clear his name in the 60s and later on, and they were unsuccessful, but he couldn't rest. He would not rest until this conviction was overturned.
And you know, I think I just would really encourage you, if you haven't read the book already, everybody, to just read it, because it's so much about not just a path, the path to the execution, but different types of paths. You get like a real sense of the veins of his life, but also like a real sense of the texture of time and place, and what the particularities of what it would have meant to be like a sailor in that time, or really any kind of like working person largely living on the fringes of society. I did wonder if you used actual court transcripts, or like if you want to talk a little, I'm sure this gets tiresome for you, if you wanted to talk a little bit about like what you use for the archives, because it is so rigorous, and I don't want it to seem like, oh, it's just because she's such a great writer and she's so smart. Like you can really read that beyond that, mashallah, like you really put the muscle in the research. And I was also curious about how did you navigate the ethics of that, since this is such an anguish story?
It is. And I studied history and politics at university. I didn't study literature, so I think there's always You should know that.
Oh my God, what a legend.
So I always feel a bit of a fraud when it comes to literature. I feel as if maybe that's why I lean towards real stories, because then you have this concrete reality or something approaching reality to base your fiction on. And my father, who was born in 1925, was someone who knew Mohamed Matan, was a peer, who was a Somali sailor who had made a very similar journey out of Somaliland in the 1940s. Having that massive age gap between you and your father, I think, connects you to a history that would otherwise feel very distant and detached. So he was my first kind of historical source. And what was fortunate was, because this story is set in the UK hoards details and facts and documents and all sorts of things, and also hides them. So the archive is, when I compare it to the Somali tradition of oral history, oral testimony, it's very elastic. So it's not kept somewhere where you have to go and find it. It's in people. And a lot of that oral history also informed my novel. But in Mahmoud's case, I could go to the archives, and thank God another researcher had forced them to open the case file earlier than they should have. It's normally 70 years between the creation of a file and its release to the public, but he forced them to release it early. And I think in 2015, I went to Kew, where the National Archives were, and just sat and took loads of photos of each of the pages and took notes. And it was fascinating. That's when I think the story, which I had learned about through the media and through my father in quite vague and formulaic terms, this poor illiterate immigrant man who was framed by this terrible racist police force, Romeo and Juliet storyline between him and Laura. When you read him in the archives, he's a different person. He tells the police, look, I speak 5 languages. let's just get that straight now. And he's not intimidated by them at all. And
sorry, so it's the real, you
Yes.
included the real documentation.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, wow.
So the police, a lot of the dialogue in the novel is actually from those archives. So I try and bring the police interviews to life, or his conversation with the prison doctor to life, or towards the end, that chapter of the court case, the trial, is exactly from the archive. I think I've added one word, but you read it as if it's fiction, because it was a fiction. It was the police concocting a narrative, a character assassination, really, motivation, all of the things that I'm trying to do, the police were doing before me. And comparing that to my own fiction was a way of embedding it in my own fiction, was a way then of saying, what is the truth? This is a novel that you're reading as a false story, as an imagined story, but the police have managed to take that imagined story and make it into historical fact.
It's interesting because of like, whenever you read a historical document and then you get a sense of how somebody recounts themselves and how they use English, and how you get a sense of dialect and slang as sort of trapped in a particular moment, and it felt very real. And some of it you could tell, okay, well, this is probably like historical documentation, but we don't get a fair amount of that till towards the end. And so the way even that the end game of your novel is really interesting, because we get this sort of, it's almost like a countdown. Like, you don't start with these like weird, portraits that are rendered by other people or by the police, that it's actually really chilling, this like relentless hunt for like a Somali guy. They're just like, we just need a guy, and we've landed on this one, and we're just gonna turn him into whatever it is we need to turn him into. But so that's actually really interesting, because we don't get a lot of that towards the end. And then there's this devastating note that you make about like what happened to the family and the consequences of that. So I think just even your sequencing is really stellar. It was actually just really, really brilliant, and adds a lot to how we can have a different ethics as a reader. We're not, you make it very hard for us to be like a voyeur and just sort of like see all these like terrible details and start to recount the most lonely and institutionalized moments of Mahmoud Matan's life. And so I just thank you for doing that.
And there's always resonances with your own life. I think you pick a story which on the surface seems completely detached from your experience or experiences. And then I started thinking, I spoke to a psychiatrist who had worked in an asylum in Cardiff, where one of the characters, Tahir Gas, who was the man that the police had identified as the man that they were looking for. I don't think he committed the murder, but they were looking for him at first. And he was hospitalized in this asylum for a while. And I was asking her about the conditions. And then she said to me at the end of the conversation, she was an elderly woman. She said, "What makes a young girl like you interested in murder?" And I'd never thought of it. I said, "I'm not interested in murder. I'm interested in the injustice and what happened to this man." And she was like, But then it never occurred to me that my own uncle was a shopkeeper who was killed outside his shop in the 1990s. And it's so weird that you can be blind to that. So, you know, on the surface, I thought my attraction was to Mahmoud and his story, but actually the more intimate connection was with Violet and what happened to her. And when I was growing up in London as well, in the early 90s, there was a miscarriage of justice involving a local man, a very public and famous murder of a woman in the local woodland. And what was shocking about it was that she had her son with her 2-year-old son, and the son was not harmed physically, but she was murdered. And so there was a big a police kind of action to find the killer, and they framed this local man who was a bit weird, you know, a loner, an outsider, maybe possibly learning difficulties. And that was a big national case for me to have on my doorstep. So again, that probably fed into the reason that this story was with me for so long.
That's a dead angle. Oh, are we doing Q&A now? Should we? Do you want to? This is up to you.
Sure.
This is your thing. Yeah.
Sure. So Violet, it's not her real name, it's her fictional name, was the daughter of a migrant from Russia who arrived in 1905, opened a few businesses and did well. You know, he was the good immigrant, while Mahmoud later on became the bad immigrant. But Violet had scoliosis of the spine, so she was a woman of disability. She was a woman who was quite, she wasn't isolated because she was extremely close to her family, but she was someone who didn't have much of a life beyond her shop. She inherited the shop in 1947, and that was her life. She was well known in the neighborhood. So her murder she was an innocent, this tiny 4'10" woman who hadn't harmed anyone, was not part of the sort of racier or more dangerous side of Tiger Bay. She was a respectable woman. I think also the fact that she was the victim of this crime created a certain frenzy around it. My empathy as a woman, as a niece, yes, it's true. I don't think that it's so strange, because I think probably the most important things, the most intimate and personal things when you're writing are the things you're completely blind to. So I didn't think of her, I didn't think of that relationship of niece and aunt or uncle. But maybe also there was a personal identification of a woman who's trying to make her own way in life beyond the expectations. You know, in the 40s or 50s, a woman was expected to get married and leave business and the world of work to her husband, especially after the Second World War. And as a Jewish woman, she was also picking up the pieces of what happened to her extended family, as many other people were in the 1940s and 50s. And that was familiar to me as well, because that's what my family were doing after the Somali Civil War. finding out who's alive, who's dead, who can be helped, how to help them. So there was lots of similarities. I'm 1.5 generation immigrant. I was born in Somalia, but brought to Britain by my family at a very young age. So that also experience of being an insider and outsider was something that I identified with. But maybe because Violet in the archive is the hardest one to grab. There's very little about her, and it's mostly dismissive. And I know that you have a question about spinsters later. It's quite, the fact that she's a spinster is meant to say there's nothing interesting here. It's meant to make her seem simple and uncomplicated, but it's not. And her existence as a woman of many challenges, who yet she left a fortune to her family. She had worked really hard through her life and was canny and clever and good at making her family wealthier. So it's just all of her talents, all of her expertise became drowned in the fact that she was murdered. And that's something that I particularly despise when it comes to stories of violence against women, is that you become the sum total. And also the case of Mahmoud, as you were saying, the sum total of the worst thing that ever happened to you.
Thank you so much for, there's so many things to look at, but like the dead angles that trauma creates, and just even physically, as we know now that there are like blocks sometimes in our actual memory, that thing can be right there in front of you. But, this is the beauty of art and storytelling very often, is it allows like another route to something that maybe is like obscured by that pain. And I'm really sorry to hear about your uncle. Definitely will keep him in drugs. It's horrific. So this is probably my favorite part of the text, is Mahmoud, the way that you spend so much time in his physicality and in the decisions that he makes and how to present himself to the public, how he moves his body, what time he leaves, who's gonna see him, who's not gonna see him, what kind of clothes he has on, the beauty, how he walks, the beauty that he appreciates in his friend whose name is so great, Berlin. So I'm so curious about that, like the silent appearances and disappearances in the text, and also the human silhouette in motion. You describe also the black man walk. Anything that you want to say more about
There's a lot
all
there.
These rich threads? Yeah.
I think that masculinity and that presentation of masculinity, particularly Black masculinity, is really interesting. The focus on clothing and style as a form of revenge. That's why I'm wearing my Elvis suit tonight. It was something I picked up from my father, where he grew up incredibly poor. He was a street child in Yemen and a child soldier in Eritrea in the Second World War, and really quite destitute, unusually destitute. But as he grew older and matured, he loved clothes. He really loved clothes. And he would go to expensive tailors in London and get the whole look, not just the tie, but the neck pin and the cravat and the thingy here, the pocket square, the hats, the shoes, the socks, the whole thing. And it's a generational thing. And I think blowing all of your wage on looking beautiful was a form of revenge against a world that tried to diminish you as much as it could. And, people do that now. They'll buy a gold chain, which is £50,000, or a Rolex. And it's a way of advertising, displaying, stating your value, your approach to your own beauty. There's a fantastic photo by Bert Hardy, who, not this photo, but my British cover, he took the photo of the man in that as well. And it's a boxer, I can't remember his name, and he's in a convertible, Black guy, looking amazing, looking swell. And the way that he's looking at the white passers-by, it shows so much pleasure and joy. That, it's for someone like Mahmoud, who arrived in Britain and instantly started, brill trimming his hair and wearing those sharp tailored suits. It's an announcement of your maturity, your sexuality, your appeal. And the message was clear. You know, it was both clear to the women and clear to the men who did not want to see that. And in Cardiff in the 1910s or 20s, I think the police chief wanted to bring in a law that Black men, and I think in this particular case, he was talking more about West Indian men, should not be allowed to wear cricket whites because they look too good.
We had so many, yeah, we have so many laws like that, you know, in the US around just like policing Black people being too hot, really, just like you can't have this on, you can't do your hair like this, or you cover your hair, then the African woman,
yes,
you know, had this beautiful like head drops. They're like, well, cut that out too. And so
yes, and
it was like a never ending thing.
Yes, yeah. And the police chief there also wanted to, the same police chief wanted to bring in a law against interracial marriage. So it was all connected, you know, looking good, looking appealing, stealing the women, stealing the jobs, just being threatening as a whole. So the style that they worked with or worked themselves into, because these were nomadic guys, and I talk about Berlin, when Berlin's arrival is in Germany as a child, when he goes as part of a human zoo to Hamburg, and he's still wearing traditional Somali cloth, which is wrapped around him. And it's, even in those pictures, they've got the feather in their hair and everything is groomed, and everyone talks about how much effort they put into styling their afros and oiling their skin. It was a dandyishness that then I think overlapped very nicely with the fashions of the 1920s and that approach again to being a dandy.
I could ask you questions forever because I just want to hear you answer them. This is another two-part question. So what is it about Somali people? Like, why are we so difficult? Like, what is in us? What is in our marrow? Why is it? It's something that is well documented. Anytime people have encountered us, they're like, these are among the most difficult people that you will ever encounter. So I think that there's a danger in that, of course, but I think that there is an element of truth that is often very funny to me, and maybe because it is my actual personality, but
and mine.
So I'm curious about like how you see that, even if you don't carry it yourself, but the perspective. Like there's this really haunting passage where Mahmoud is seen as guilty because he's cheeky, because he sort of like talks back, he's not ashamed enough. But then at the same time, they're like, his face is so like, he has sad eyes. It's like, you're gonna be convicted for a murder because you have sad eyes, according to a random white person. But this is like, my parents would really police my eyes and my gaze. Like, you don't know what these people are capable of. Like, you need to be very careful. So I'm curious, like, this whole roiling world of things that is recounted in your book, how do you look at that? And then the second part of the question is, because you touched on it, the desirability politics, the fact that Mahmoud is in an interracial marriage, there is love there, but it's complicated. It's not a love that I would desire for myself. And you don't like make it super easy on white people either. Or him. Yeah, or him for sure. But like also not on like white women or white womanhood. And so I'm very curious, like how you move through your paces with these things.
It's a big question.
I know. It's so many things, but I'm trying to squeeze it in and everybody's good. They're trying to break the fast. I'm trying to get
I'll be quick.
Yeah.
So the first part of the question was about Somalis being difficult.
Yeah. What's that?
Well, to go back to those colonial sources, you know, they put it down to lots of things. You know, they put it down to the fact that Somalis don't have a king or a chief in the same way that other societies did. So every man thought he was important, and a kind of vague democracy was in place. And the fact that they were Muslims as well added to their sense that Somalis are fanatical and difficult and dangerous and, you know, don't fear death and all the rest of it. But as an insider, what do I think about it all? I think that we're There's a lot of pride that's instilled, a lot of being very direct and challenging, maybe not an emphasis on conflict resolution, which should be there. And Mahmoud was a particular case because the awful irony is he was the only innocent Somali to have been executed. He was the only man to have been convicted of murder and to be executed. And he was the only innocent one. There were quite a few others. Tahir Gas, who I mentioned earlier, who was in an asylum for some time. 2 years later, in 1954, he did murder someone. He murdered a man, and he had psychosis and was not hanged. He was sent to Broadmoor, a psychiatric prison in Britain, and then released after a year back to Somaliland. And that was the case of all of the others. The year before this happened, in 1951, there was a conflict between two Somalis about money. So all of the Somali sailors would live in boarding houses, and they would leave. The boarding house was their living quarters, it was their bank, it was their canteen, everything was there for them. So the guy who ran the boarding house was entrusted with a lot of trust, and this individual was accused of taking money from another Somali. So one day when he was playing dice in the street, the other Somali came and shot him in the head and killed him. But he was not executed for this. And later on in 1960, there was a Somali guy who shot 5 British men dead. And he was not executed.
No, but do you know what's the logic? Because, I just feel like in the US, they're like, la-di-da-di, everybody, like and I'm not even making light of it. It's literally like, you're all dying if you were just even standing around, especially at a certain time.
Of course.
And so I'm really curious.
That's my expectation.
Yeah, like how did they pick and choose, or was it because they were just sending men back home and they were like, well, if we deport them, it's not our problem anymore?
It's too complicated. I think even that can't really explain it, because generally, if you were Black, Asian, non-white at that period of time, you would be more likely to be convicted and sentenced to death, and more likely to have that sentence carried out across the board. So Mahmoud in this year was one of 5 Black and Asian men who was executed.
Oh, wow.
But the other cases where there was strong evidence, there were witnesses, there was strong evidence, the men either were very mentally unwell or appeared or were willing to give the appearance of that. And Mahmoud never did. He never submitted. He never went along with their story. He never demeaned himself in front of them. He was consistent all the way through that he had nothing to do with it, and they were never going to persuade him to say that he did have anything to do with it. And I think it was that rebelliousness and the threat that he posed as this man who'd only, as to go on to the next part of the question, who'd married a Welsh white woman and had the gall to stand there in front of them saying that all police are liars, and that they were looking for a Black man to accuse. He said everything to their face. And I doubt that the others would have done that or did do that.
It is. It's really complex, and I don't even know how to describe it. It's not easy necessarily, or like a good experience, but it's like a very rich one, a very fulfilling one to consider the different elements of anger that are at play, or like it really was the embodiment, some elements, especially Mahmoud towards the end, of the Somali word il, which is so hard to sort of translate, but it's just like
blood boiling.
The blood boiling, skin prickling, like the anguish that doesn't leave you. It's like you're sleeping on a bed of like biting red ants or something, like the different types of anger, that you show us Mahmoud in his joy, him in his shame, trying to joke things off, him pleading with God for relief and different kinds of relief. And so, yeah, I'm really interested in the emotional spectrum, even though the situation itself is so limited.
Yes. He's a complicated person, and he does show anger. And one of the things that surprised me when I read the archive was how many people accused him of things. there were dozens, it seemed, of people who said he did this to me, he did that to me. And I managed to meet one of them. He's the Nigerian watchmaker in the novel, who was also a very angry man. And he was still working in Portobello Market in West London into, up until a few years ago. And he was very angry, and he was, feuding with all of the other shopkeepers in the arcade. And it took me a good while before he would trust me and talk to me. But when I first spoke to him and said, "Oh, what do you know about Mahmoud Matan?" He said, "That man looked good." That was the first thing that came back to his mind. He was like, "That man looked good. But did you see what they did to him?" And Olabisi, he, I think, had battled his way through life, and he was full of anger about different racial slights that he experienced. When he tried to buy a house in West London, the neighbors had tried to stop him, just one thing after another. And Mahmoud, I think, had been 5 years in this country or in the UK, and didn't want to keep swallowing that anger, keep swallowing that rage.
Yeah. Right. Because he gives it back or sometimes mirrors it. And I have noticed that when faced with whether they're all out racist, but in any case have a limited perspective of who you are, to simply mirror, like someone is coming at you with rage and you don't take it into yourself, induces more rage in them and a will to punish and suppress. Like I experienced that in school, walking down the street, random police officers. It's like anywhere that you can think of, in a doctor's office. I'm sure many people in the audience have too. And so that's actually really critical. People are about to, for those who don't know, people are about to break fast momentarily. So don't be alarmed. You see some like date eating and water drinking. Was the watchmaker not, we have about a minute, but like, we can pause now? I think so, yeah.
Okay, we'll take a quick break.
Sorry, just
I believe him. Yeah, yeah, he had a reason. And Mahmoud's like, I never. But I'm like,
You're in an app. Hello.
Hi, everyone. We'll start again.
I think so. So some folks stepped away, but they'll be back in a few moments, just to make space to pray. But we wanted to start again with having a few moments in Nadifa's voice. I don't know if you want to contextualize the quote.
Yes, this is one of Ladan's suggestions to read, and it's a passage I really love as well, and don't read it from very much at all for some reason. But it's when Mahmoud is in jail after the trial, after he's been found guilty, and he's waiting on the appeals process, which he thinks is too small a word, which he needs to go his way, because otherwise his whole life is lost in this injustice. But this is him outside getting some air from the cell, the execution suite, as they called it, where he spent 24 hours a day under surveillance by 2 prison guards who sat with him 24 hours a day. It's not that Mahmoud believes himself important. The past few months have torn away that illusion. But he is extraordinary. His life has been extraordinary. The things he has got away with, the things he has been punished for, the things he has seen, the way that it had once seemed possible for him to bend with great force everything to his will. His life is one long film with mobs of extras and exotic, expensive sets, long reams of film and miles of dialogue extending back as he struts from one scene to another. He can imagine how his movie looks even now. The camera zooming in from above onto the cobblestone prison yard and then merging into a close-up of his thoughtful, upturned face, smoke billowing out from the corner of his dark lips. A color film, it must be that. It is everything: comedy, music, dance, travel, murder, the wrong man caught, a crooked trial, a race against time, and then the happy ending, the wife swept up in the hero's arms as he walks out one sun-filled day to freedom. The image stretches Mahmoud's mouth into a smile. Up above, a seagull careens through the midday sky, and from somewhere unseen, a crow repeatedly cows, seeming to enjoy the vibration in its throat. Life. It is so simple and beautiful. The waxy leaves of an ivy vine snaking up from the sterile ground, a spider twitching on its bejeweled web, the flow of air in Mahmoud's lungs and the rush of blood through his heart, all of it beyond his control, all of it somehow both fleeting and eternal. He, himself, could disappear from the world just as easily as a seagull winding an aimless path in the air, its bones falling apart one day somewhere hidden and mysterious, no one thinking to ask after it. He is a man, and there are other men, just as there are other seagulls. But what he can't shake is the idea that the world will end in a tiny way without him.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad I got to hear that in your own voice. The elegiac tone, what I really appreciate is that you understand that the focus has to be on life. Like there's this moment where Mahmoud is sorry that his body will expire, and he's just like considering like his physical body and the grief that he has that it will no longer be. And I was just like, oh, I've been punched so hard in the stomach. I mean, because we think about it, we understand, and this is part of what is so detestable and disgusting about capital punishment. Is just kind of this drawn out sorrow that people, none of us are equipped to face it. But I guess because, you know, some people committed a crime, they have to do this impossible thing and live with this impossible weight before they're killed for people to watch and put in a newspaper or something like that.
And it's kind of incredible to me as well, the US now and the UK in the past, and potentially in the future, if this right-wing government does bring back the death penalty, is this idea of civilization against barbarity, and civilization including the death penalty being part of the civilized world. And that was part of what the British introduced into their colonies. They wanted to teach people the value of life by taking life. And that caused a lot of resistance in places like Somalia, where the idea of coldly executing someone was not acceptable.
Right. We do have this like slight, I don't want to speak for all Somali people, but there's this like understanding, because Mahmoud even notes it, of like a crime of passion, or the retribution that's sort of like immediate to the harm done against you, versus this other thing, which does feel very kind of like weird in a completely different way.
It's the human sacrifice.
Yeah, it's like seasons of it. People are watching. There are rituals. There are hoops to jump through. There's paperwork.
Yes, and it was very ritualized in the UK. They didn't have the last meal and all of that, but the whiskey or shot of brandy beforehand, and the meeting with the priest or the imam in this case, the negotiation of how much the executioner would charge, and, you know, where would he sleep and what would be his dinner that night and how much ale would he get. And it was interesting that the man who executed Mahmoud Matan, Albert Pierrepoint, was from a dynasty of executioners. His grandfather, his uncle, and him, he ended up being the most prolific executioner in British history. And Mahmoud is not even a footnote in his story. There are many other more famous cases which he wrote about, and he sold his story to the tabloids after he retired. But his uncle, or potentially his grandfather, maybe even both, took their own lives. So there was something about the weight of being an executioner, of being the one who actually sees that person in their last moments, holds them in their last moments, that destroyed them as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex thing. And I think that the timing too, and I don't know if you felt that need, you know, like there's so many things that were going on in the time that you're writing this book and then publishing it. It's like so many things around the punishment of the state, around execution, around Black masculinity.
For sure. But it never went away.
Yeah, no, of course it never went away, but it became this, you know, we're all held hostage within COVID as well. And so I think just even the timing, you know, of the release of your book and what the content would be about, I remember it was really interesting when I first read the description.
And it was strange timing, because this was a novel that had been with me for about 17 years. And writing it, even when I was young, I was considered to be a person obsessed with injustice, obsessed with race, and, you know, it being almost unfashionable and retrograde. That you need to get over these things. People don't care about that kind of stuff anymore. But if you keep your eyes even vaguely open, you can see that it's never gone away. It's never gone away. And that murder of George Floyd,
yes.
of George Floyd, I never watched it. I never
No.
watched it.
No.
And I think what it did do was remind me of how slow it is to kill someone. That the human body wants to live, it wants to survive. And even with hanging, you don't die immediately. You're kept hanging on that rope for an hour to make sure that your heart is stopped. And the physicality of that, the way that time stills around that. And in Britain, where the police generally are not armed with guns, this is how they kill people. This is how they've always killed people. It's through suffocation and slowly watching the life seep out of them. So I think that the knowledge of how he had died, how George Floyd had died, made me think about all of the things that I had always been imbibing, but it gave a visual and an audio. Even if you just caught 10 seconds, 20 seconds, a minute of it, that was enough. The horror of it was enough.
Yeah. What do you make of this? The meanness, the relentlessness of this, institutionalized white supremacy, the hunt that is, it's pervasive. It's, obviously so much a part of so many aspects of life, but I don't know how to frame what is it I'm saying, but it's almost like
Cruelty.
yeah, the cruelty and the ill will as well that sort of like can culminate in murder, but there are also all these other instances that are worth noting to Mahmoud, even as he's on death row. It's like, oh, just because this person was worried I'd steal her purse, she looked at me funny and now I must face this terrible destiny because I was too proud because of this, because of that, there is this like litany is the subject that has to sort of face this. I mean, I understand it to be a kind of demonic in the sense of against life, and it doesn't have a logic. It's just interested in chaos and oblivion, and that's totally how I understand racism. But yeah, like, what do you make of it, and how did it feel inside of your body to write through it and to give us all these different perspectives of the same question, of the same central?
Yeah. Well, the sort of more rational, historical side of me would say, well, it was to do with the violence of creating empires, of the way that they had to destroy themselves to be able to send young men out to commit atrocities, to die of drink or suicide. All of it was so ridden with violence and despair that the fact that some people were making huge profits and building this country into being a great country as they saw it, it took a toll on everyone, on the children in public schools and the children in orphanages, and in the texture of a society that becomes one of domination and violence and sadism. And it's not unique to any particular place. I've witnessed it in Somaliland. I've witnessed it in other places. The relationship of power to the powerlessness, and the way that people toy with people when they have no power. But that sadism, I think, is an important thing to look at bluntly. And we were just saying in the break that the funny thing about the police in the novel is they're bureaucratic in their violence. They never racially abuse him to his face. I couldn't tell from the archive whether they were violent with him. And I'm sure if they were violent with him, they wouldn't have written it down. They wouldn't leave proof of it. But on the surface, it's all very clean and cold. Yeah. And yet they quietly and happily arrange his death for a murder he didn't commit.
Well, yeah, because there's this like inhumane thing that's happening to somebody that they don't understand to be a human in the way that they're human. And I think that level of delusion and that level of disconnect probably does create like a profound emptiness.
Yes.
That is like,
and I think
can manifest as, and also you have to, I imagine if you're in that system, like you have to keep going. There was this one point where I gasped and had to put the book down when I first read it. Like I put it down for a while, like a couple of weeks at least, where there's I think it's a police officer who's like thinking about how he can get a job for his nephew or something, like how this big trial will create jobs within his family or for somebody that he knows.
And it's also like a bloodletting. You know, you introduce the younger versions of yourself into what you do through a bloodletting, by having them witness a lynching, by having them, you know, put the blood on their forehead and be initiated in that way. So, but I never answered your question about his relationship to Laura. And it makes me then wonder about how did they fall in love? I think they genuinely did love each other. And to be a mixed race, interracial couple in that time was a form of insanity. It made no sense on either side. For him to have to complicate his reaction and his relationship to this white domination, and for her to see him as the person, as the attractive individual that he was, and look through all of that cloud and smoke to see him. And I think that also is something that is uncomfortable. He must have, I think, she said he was never violent towards her, and I believe that, but I wonder in which ways his anger towards the world outside of their home was reenacted inside that home. And he as a man, her as a woman, again, there's that other oppression, that other dynamic going on. So it's all kind of ugly, it's all complicated, and it's all, I think, something that doesn't really make any sense.
No, no, not entirely. But, you know, his widow was, I mean, it was horrible, and it's not a fair exercise. It's not a fair measure of love or the human spirit, but her relentless pursuit of justice and of clearing his name. From the time, if I have this correct, that because you have an end note about it, that she, you know, understands that he's been executed because they didn't inform her, and she comes to visit him, and from then on sort of has just like you know, seems to have petitioned everybody, including, you know, had the support of the Somali community. And so this is something that went on from at some point in the 50s through to the 90s. So it really became like her mantle that she took upon herself. It was like this, like, as much as the police and the state was relentless and sort of just putting someone in the pit, right? She was like, I am going to exhume and resurrect and correct the record on behalf of my beloved, you know, husband.
And she was dying. She was dying of cancer when they finally did clear his name. And that, to go back to rage, I think that she had a lot of rage in her. And there were moments when she had the strength to pursue his, the quashing of his conviction. But other times she fell apart and was hospitalized and had mental health issues and was not a great mother at times either. So it was an incredibly sad cycle of trauma that was enacted on both families, both the murder victim and Mahmoud's family. But somehow in the 1990s, and it was connected to another miscarriage of justice around the Cardiff 3, where 3 men were accused, 5 men to begin with, and then 3 men were convicted of a murder that they didn't commit. Again, mixed race and Black men, one of them half Somali. And the police did the exact same thing. They concocted a crazy story of how they killed this young woman, Lynette White, as part of an initiation, some sort of senseless, savage initiation. And it was all fabricated. But the men spent time in prison before they were released and had their convictions overturned.
Reveals so much about somebody's character and their baseline for what's normal, what the lie that they create about somebody else, and the logic that they sort of like assign, you know, many times to Black people. Like, their definition of a savage is literally something most of the time we're like, we don't know, we never heard of anything like that, bro. Like, that's really like unhinged. And that is also, you also touch on that in a very, very elegant way, the push-pull of being seen as a savage, and the sort of like combustible nature of injustice and the rage of it almost making you into a savage.
Yeah, to what they're saying that you are. And yeah, it's got deep roots, I think, in the UK. And in the colonial period, there were all of these accounts of meeting cannibals. You know, you'd end up washed up, shipwrecked on an island, and ooh, there's cannibals. But actually, many of the indigenous people that they were meeting were not cannibals.
Oh, yeah.
But they were eating each other.
They were the cannibals. And there's so much, like, because I remember I went to a talk in Berlin about that in like 2017. And it was just like this woman had, this French woman that like had all this like horrible, horrific documentation about like European people just like eating each other, eating other people, and then accusing everybody else of being cannibals.
Yeah. So that transference of guilt and of savagery onto the other, when you can't look at your own actions. And you know, it was often because they were dying on a boat, and you know, someone had to die or someone had to live. But I guess it's a dishonesty. It's that deep dishonesty, and then the need to transpose it onto another person.
Right, yeah.
That's the problem.
Yeah, and it was also like in the US, there's like these horrific passages. There's a woman who wrote about it, and there's like this like terrifying excerpt in like the New Yorker or something, where she's like, it's from the actual documentation of like, instead of just like asking, they'd already taken so much, but like asking indigenous people for help, they just had this paranoia of this dark, swarthy like figure, that this shadow was like infiltrating their homes, and they just turned on themselves and each other. And cannibalism entered the picture, and the indigenous people were like, we could have given you some seeds, bro. Like, it's not that deep. Like, it could have been. And so this, even just like this unnecessary assumption, you know, like, I would rather this than the unknown savage, which is capable of even worse than this. Because you have to think about it. If you're already a cannibal, then you're going to be like, well, what are these other people that I understand to be evil or less than me or savage in some way? It's like probably something like unimaginable for us.
But also the age of exploration for Europe began at a time when Europe was living through this violence and sadism and immense cruelty to each other, of torture and inquisitions and burnings at the stake. It was a terrible, I think the people who were leaving Spain, Britain, France, Holland, they were the worst versions of themselves. Maybe a few hundred years before that, or God knows after that, if it hadn't been that group of people living through those religious wars, maybe a different interaction could have happened.
Exactly. No, because of the trauma. So that really struck me when it was like this account of sort of like, why didn't you just like ask us? Like, why were you so, and it's just like, well, these people are so traumatized, they just seared like into themselves. But I don't know if I've asked you many things, but if there's anything you wanted to add, and if you did, then please go ahead. But otherwise, maybe it's a good time to have people.
Time for questions.
Yeah. Ask questions. Just like staring at people that I know. Sorry.
How's it going, Nadifa? Thank you, and welcome back to New York City again. Ladan as well. Just a quick question. During that time period when a lot of the seamen were leaving, Somaliland, Somalia, coming to Britain and other shores, were there other African diaspora that was there at the same time? And if they were, what backgrounds were they from? Just curious about that.
Sure. There were. So in the context of people who were arriving as sailors, there were West Indian sailors, West African sailors. There's a mention of the crew, at the time it was spelled Kroo, from Liberia. And they were also manual workers on the ships, but seen as being good guys. The Somalis were bad guys, and not Christian, not Anglophone, problematic in various ways, while the crew were reliable colonial workers. And of course, the Caribbean provided a lot of labor to Britain after the Second World War, as on the transport service, in hospitals, in Harold Cover, who was the prosecution witness against Mahmoud, was a carpenter and a stowaway. So a lot of men were arriving as stowaways. And because they were coming from places that were nominally British, they would normally spend about a month in jail and then be allowed to enter the country and start their lives. So there was a growing Black population from 1948 onwards. And that's also part and parcel, I think, of what was going on with Mahmoud. It was generally young men, some of them bringing in their habits, smoking weed or playing music too loud, all of the things that disturbed this quite staid post-war society.
Good evening. My name is Tony, and it was a pleasure hearing you, Nadifa, speak about your book and also read in your own voice. That was a good treat. So you mentioned that you were thinking about this project for 17 years and it took you 18 months to write. What did you learn about yourself during that time and that process? Because it seems like a really heavy topic to cover, and I'm just curious to learn about that.
Thank you. It's an interesting question. What did I learn? I think I changed. So I found out about Mohamed Matan's story before I'd written anything. It was the first creative project that I thought of doing by myself. And it was meant to be a film at the beginning, and the research process then made me ask my father deeper questions because he knew Mahmoud. I found that much out. So I wanted to know more about Mahmoud from my father, but he gave me very little, but instead gave me this incredible biography of his own and everything that he experienced. And that became my first novel. And then I wrote another novel set in Somalia during the 1980s. So in that time, I think I learned the skills that I needed to be able to write this novel the way I wanted it to be. I think it was both, as a person, I'd matured in those 17 years, but I think as a writer, I probably developed a confidence that I didn't have at the beginning because I never aimed to be a writer. It was felt like I was doing something quite off the track that I was meant to be on. And also that I lost certain things. If I'd written the book when I first learned about Mohamed Matan, then I would have been able to potentially meet Laura, his children, all of the Somalis who were closely involved with the case. And by the time I did reach the writing process in 2015, most of them had died. But it became something else because of that. The archive was open and it wouldn't have been in 2004-05.
Hi, Nadifa. Hi, Ladan. Thank you so much for a really wonderful conversation so far. I have two questions that I'm going to say short, and you can take either of them, combine them, whatever you like. One, I wanted to invite you to kind of talk about the relationship between the three books that you've written so far, and you kind of gestured toward it just now. Maybe things that you see as a through line or things that depart from one another, but really helped you shape the next project, and how this book maybe is shaping your future projects or current projects. And then the other question is, what is some of the chosen kin in other texts, books, poetry, films of this book? Like, how would you want us to read, think with you on?
Yeah. Can I start with the second part first? So there's, I was thinking about this earlier today for some reason, where there's a section when Mahmoud is first arrested and he doesn't expect to spend much time in jail. And he's put in the same cell as Lloyd, who's one of the lodgers in his building, in his boarding house. And Lloyd is kind of the nightmare, who's unemployed most of the time. He smokes a lot of weed. He's a boxer. He likes the ladies. In London, he was pimping out young women. But he goes on this riff about how London is in the summer, and he says, London in the summer really be hearts. And that's a direct reference to a similar line in The Lonely Londoners by Sam Salvon, which was published in the 1950s, late 50s. So that has definitely got some kinship to this novel. Also, I think this is a harder one to kind of quantify, but the whole world that I grew up in of Somali sailors born in the 1920s and 30s, their sense of humor, their love of poetry. I was lucky enough to become close friends with Hudaydi, a Somali musician and composer, and his humor and he was in the Royal Navy for a year in 1947. So his stories, his perspective, that kind of contradictory approach to life, where sometimes it's very political, other times it's careless and, you know, about pleasure and just enjoying yourself and being free. All of that fed into it. I restrained myself from reading In Cold Blood by Truman Capote until I'd finished the novel, because I was worried it would be too much of an influence. But it was interesting after I'd finished the novel and read In Cold Blood, how similar some of the choices were. And that sort of that fine place somewhere between fiction and fact that Truman Capote was going for, and I went for as well. And I think in a lot of my work, there's always the ghost of Claude McKay, who lived but not very far from here. And Ladan and I last year went to his grave to pay our respects, and he was a poet and a stoker. He was in the same role as my father and Mahmoud Matan in the 1920s. So yeah, I think there's quite a few, and there's always music. I think with Black Mamba Boy, I had a habit of starting every chapter with a line from a song. And that gave me the spirit of it. And in this novel, I was listening to a lot of Eartha Kitt, the Ink Spots. Who else? A lot of 50s music, where you can see that there's this changed approach where the women are sassy and, you know, they're asking where are their diamonds and their furs, and the men are out there as well, really kind of pushing back against the trope of being obedient and well-behaved. And yeah, the first part of your question was to do with the relationship between the novels. So yes, I think there's a clear relationship between this and Black Mamba Boy, and it's almost as if this novel begins 5 years after Black Mamba Boy's finished, but the tone is completely different. So my father told me his story as one of adventure and excitement and of victory. You know, he was there in his 80s telling me this, and he was comfortable, and he's like, look at my life, my fridge is full, I've got everything I could ever want, how amazing, I won. Basically his attitude was I won. And with Mahmoud was this parallel shadow figure who did not win. He lost everything. So the tone is different. There's all of that disappointment and heartbreak of those 5 years in Britain. And my father made a very different choice, where he just didn't stop traveling. That was his way of avoiding a lot of this, is just to keep on the move. And Mahmoud settled down with his wife and 3 children. And in a sad way, I think that probably was the mistake that he made.
Well, I think we're maybe okay. I was going to say last question.
Pretty loud, so I might not need the mic. Hi, y'all. So forgive me, because I'm gonna kind of have my question, but I'm gonna think through the words exactly. So I'm thinking about it in terms of 2 parts, right? But first of all, y'all are both fantastic. Love you both, mashallah. And so in terms of thinking about redemption and thinking about second chances, right? I think in this particular story where he was wrongfully convicted, right? But I wanted to pose the question of what would your storytelling have looked like had he actually done this horrific act? Would have changed anything for you? And then the second thing I was considering is like mentioning that some of us are the sum total of some of the most horrible things that have happened to us. What did you imagine his life could have been had this not taken place?
Wow, 2 heavy questions. So to answer the second one first, I do think about that. And I was doing an event yesterday at Harvard, and I was thinking about who he would have been if I was able to interview him in his 80s, like I was able to with my father. What would he have said about all of this? Would he have kind of forgotten and let it go and put it down to the difficulties of life in the 1950s? Or would he still be full of anger and resentment, and would it have distorted the rest of his life? Would it have changed the relationship that he had to Laura and his children? And would he have left the country? Would he return to Somaliland and settle there and remarry and put that part of his life behind him? It's very difficult to think. He's trapped forever as this 20-something-year-old man who in that last year of his life was quite dislocated, quite troubled. And I remember I met one of the Somali sailors who had known him, Ismail Isa, and he was in his 90s when we spoke. And he was with Mahmoud on his wedding day. And he said that by the time this all happened, Hafife, he'd kind of lost it. He was wasn't stable anymore. And I think that the Somali community, they were there for him. They paid for his lawyer and barrister and supported him in material ways. But then he became, I guess, almost that sacrifice. If you get too close to this society, this is what happens to you. He was the lesson learned. And that's quite a brutal thing. The first part of your question. Yes, very much so. If he actually had killed Violet Valaki, it would have been a harder struggle to develop that empathy and intimacy that I think I developed with him as a character. It wouldn't have made him out of bounds. I would have still been intrigued. I still would have wanted to know all of the steps that happened and what made him into this kind of person who could do that. But it would have been very difficult, I think, to love him. I think right now I love him. And I don't think I would have loved him if he had committed a crime like that. I would have been interested, intrigued, but the love wouldn't be there. And I think there's a lot of anger in this novel, but there's also a lot of love. So the whole atmosphere would have changed.
Were there any other questions? Last call. I'm not that good at scanning the room, so.
People are hungry. I think we
People are
should.
hungry. Okay, well, thank
You'll
you
see
all
some
so much
hungry
for being
faces.
here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nadifa, for such a wonderful talk. As you can see, her books are available. Buy them, get them signed. If you don't already have her other two books, Black Mama Boy and Orchard of Lost Souls, you should absolutely get them. And thank you all so much.
And a round of
speaking
applause
with
for
us.
Ladan, please, for these amazing
Oh.
questions.
Home isn't just where we're from. It's the sounds that move us. The stories that shape us. And the flavors that heal us. It's the communities that connect us. The ones that hold us down. The ones that raise us up. Home is a feeling we all know. So if you're looking for it, you can always find it here. The Africa Center. Home is here.